Nice to see you again for a second day in a row. Little double live stream right there. And so, thank you once again for joining me. We'll get started here in just a moment. As you can see from the thumbnail, and if you joined us yesterday for Christian Witnesses of Jah live discussion number 17, then I kind of talked a little bit about this show and what it would involve and some of the reasons for it. We'll give everybody a few minutes to join the live, but essentially, the reason I wanted to do this show is because the first show, which is in the description below, I linked it for you if you haven't seen it. We talked about a number of texts and this question of whether the New Testament prohibits polygamy, right? Because no one really, it's not an issue with the Old Testament. Everybody agrees that in the Old Testament there was no prohibition against having more than one woman if you're a man, right? You cannot have more than one man in the Bible as a woman. Unless, one of them dies and, for example, in the law, the husband's brother takes the wife. So even the law, which Jesus himself fulfilled and didn't transgress, and so obviously accepted everything in it, makes it clear that, so if, for example, the surviving brother of the husband who died had a wife, he could then take his brother's wife. So the Bible in the Old Testament in no way prohibits having more than one woman for a man. We have examples, right, with Solomon and others. Now, again, people often say, well, yeah, but look what happened to Solomon. That's not because he had more than one woman. It may be, and probably was because he had more than one foreign woman, right, who was helping mislead him with these false gods. But the idea itself practiced all throughout the Hebrew scriptures, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. The idea of having more than one woman as a man in the Old Testament is not in and of itself prohibited or otherwise described in a negative way. So then you get into the New Testament, like I talked about in my first video on this subject, and you see things, you have Jesus who's fulfilling the law, right? He's not breaking the law. He's not saying that it's wrong to have more than one wife and then fulfilling the law. If you want to make that argument, again, I wanted to do a live show as well, because in case, you can always put a comment below, but if you actually have a question, you want to interact, I'm a little more fluid here. So I have some things I'm going to get to and discuss relative to this question and go back to some New Testament texts. But you're free to put down what you think is your best anti-polygamy or pro-polygamy or whatever your view of a man having more than one woman. Now, in the Bible, when I say that, when I say a man, when I speak of polygamy, right, I understand it's a charged word like polytheism, like I mentioned yesterday. We have to overcome these pejorative associations. But hey, if it's convenient and we can do it, fine. Otherwise, I just say a man who can have more than one woman. Now, what does that mean as I understand it from the Bible? Okay, I've talked about this in part 1, so I'm going to summarize some things here, but I give the text there. I'm happy to go over them again here if necessary. But basically what I established from part 1 is that in the Bible, having more than one woman means you don't get rid of any of them. You're not allowed in the Bible to just take a woman home, have relations with her, and then get rid of her. So that's against what the Bible teaches. And in the New Testament, it's explicitly, in every single account where Jesus talks about adultery, he speaks of a man or woman leaving her husband or his wife, a man who leaves his wife. That's always the context and what he's talking about. He's never talking about a man who takes another woman as a wife or someone he's that's part of his family now, right? In the Bible, that's what it's talking about. It's not talking about just like you see often today, right? These very you may have more than one woman with a man, but they're just very subject to leaving or doing whatever they want, right? That's not what the Bible teaches. It does say if someone leaves, then fine. You're going to see that. We're going to read it. But as a Christian or even as a pre-Christian Jew, you were not to leave your woman. When the woman became yours, and it was considered the man's woman, right? Actually, not as property in the sense that like everything else is, right? Obviously more special, because you become one, right? In the Bible, you become one with the woman, and you don't become one with your other property, right? Like animals and things. The man was the one who owned the woman in that way, but not like it's always depicted today in the worst part, right? No one can even, they hear that and they just freak out. What? Man owned yeah, because the man, you were his wife, and he had children by you, and he took care of you. And this is how God prepared the earth. And the way that many people today, you feminists, a lot of you homos and others who've totally chosen a life of self-destruction, you're not making anything better. Nothing you're doing is in any way improving anything, and there's evidence everywhere to show it. So no, your ways don't work. A lot of people say, well, look at all the problems that would come with having more than one woman. Again, in the Bible, that's not the case. And it's never presented as the problem, as something, well, having more than one woman, that's just too difficult to do. It may be difficult and problematic because of our sin, because we can't do it, right? We've gotten worse, just like with the original development of humans from Adam and Eve. And genetically, it's been shown scientifically, we all descended from one woman. Well, then obviously earlier on, things like incest was not as big of a problem. It was necessary in order for the human family to develop, and that's what happened. The problem is we had sin right from the start, and obviously the development of humans in a greater and greater sinful capacity led to more and more problems, physically and otherwise, like we see today, because of the death penalty and the damage that was done by the choices that were made. So I don't know that is anyone going to argue that? And how would you do that? What kind of evidence would you show that early on there wasn't this kind of incest type relationship and development from the children of Adam and Eve? And why would that be wrong? Bible doesn't say that's wrong. Again, it's the sin that makes it wrong. That's what's causing the problems, everybody. Even in hetero, right? We've got hetero relationships all over, and they're collapsing left and right. Like, it's the worst ever. So what are you talking about, that somehow having one woman is better and less problematic than not? Maybe. I quite honestly couldn't see it happening today, not in this country, not in the United States and maybe other similar developed countries, because women have totally forgotten who they are and what they're even here to do. They're here to help men beautify the earth, reproduce children, and glorify God. That's it. You're not supposed to be running around acting like you're a man, putting tons of makeup on that projects an image and face that's not really yours in the first place, distracting men all over the place because now we're seeing this enhancement of your beauty all over. You don't think that bothers us? So exactly what is it you women are trying to accomplish out there? I realize not all of you are doing the same things, but many of you are. Look at all the money that you're spending on things like makeup. Is that really necessary? It's up to you. I'm not going to judge you for it. It doesn't seem like that's the best way to go about developing real relationships, right? If you're enhancing yourself that much and walking around in ways where we're distracted because it's not normal, and it's like you've done things to make yourself get more attention. Look at all the money and time and effort that goes into you preparing a face. Many of you who put on more than just maybe a little bit, but I don't know why, other than sunscreen, you don't like your face. We have to wear our face. And yet we're dealing with all these women out here who don't want to help men, don't really understand how to help. You guys can barely cook and clean now, right? And I do that all the time. And I do it no matter what. What's wrong with cooking and cleaning? You've been lied to. You've been made to think the things that are essential to your actual normal life and enjoyment are bad. Shouldn't do it. Don't help man. Sounds demonic. Sounds like someone who's telling you things that are wrong and you're just listening to them because maybe you really desire it. That's really the problem, right? Same with men. Got all these effeminate men and other people out here not providing a good example for humans. So we have a lot more difficult conditions. I agree. That doesn't change what the Bible teaches. I'm here to present what the Bible teaches. I'm here to comply with the laws of the land and present what the Bible teaches unless there's an absolute conflict, right? Like the Bible says, do this. You must do this. And a law says you can't do that. Or the Bible says, don't do this. And a law says you have to do that. That's explicit conflict. Bible wins every time with me. When it comes to this question of polygamy, right? So you do have laws of the land, like in the United States, you can't marry more than one woman, but you can have more than one woman live with you, right? So if you're not breaking a law of the land and you're not clearly violating a prohibition in the Bible, right? Because we believe in three things above all else, but we also recognize the clear, explicit, do not do this things, right? Of course. If you're not violating something like that, we cannot read our own views into a judgment about other people. Okay, so what does the Bible explicitly state? Well, like I talked about in the first part of this kind of two-part series, probably just be these two. I don't really need to do a whole lot. Maybe we'll talk about it again, but for now, I think this is a good follow-up because in that video, I show, and in fact, we'll go to it right now. I show that there's really only one text, right? There's only one text in the New Testament that limits the number of women a man can have. You remember it? Let's go to it right now. Let me go ahead and bring up the Bible Hub. And I've got some text here too that I remember to. See, I have another computer I do a lot of my work on. So sometimes when I'm doing work on that computer, I have to email it to myself on this one where I do the video streaming. And that's why sometimes, like yesterday, I didn't have the text I was prepared to use ready because of that reason. But we were able to pull them up no problem. So we'll do the same here if we need to. Let's take a look, though, at, let's look at Titus. Let's look at Titus chapter 1. Let me make this a little bigger for you guys here. This is the text, right? This is the text. We'll read it in the NWT and then we'll go over, right? I use the New World Translation primarily because I grew up around Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm very familiar with it, obviously, as many of you who know me. I realize it's not perfect. You can use whatever Bible you want. We'll go to the Bible Hub in a minute. But if you don't really understand the NWT and all you think about it is negative stuff, then I don't think you've looked close enough. And either way, you can bring up any issues or differences among the translations if you choose to. And we'll talk about it if it's necessary. Okay, let me make that just a little lower there. Let's look at the NWT and then we'll go to the Bible Hub. All right. And this is the one text. Okay, this is it. This is this is like the one God the Father for, theology stuff in the Bible. This is that kind of clarity clear type text about the issue. Okay, it says this, and it's like clear. Okay, one woman. What is it talking about? Well, here it is. So this is Paul writing to Titus, right? He says, "For this reason I left you in Crete, that you might correct the things that were defective, and might make appointments of older men in city after city, as I gave you orders. If there is any man free from accusation, a husband of one wife, having believing children that were not under a charge of debauchery nor unruly. For an overseer must be free from accusation as God's steward." Okay, let's stop there for a second. We'll read the rest of it. But you can see here, he starts and ends this description he gives with being free from an accusation, right? What kind of accusation could be made against a Jewish Christian or just a Christian about having more than one woman? Well, there's nothing in the Old Testament, right? And if you think so, go ahead and put it down. I've already referenced several examples. Part 1 of this series, I read and discuss several examples. Talk about Jesus' illustration of the 10 virgins. Other texts, 1 Corinthians 7, which we'll get to. Right, the whole parallel with 144,000 virgins. There's really nothing explicit in the New Testament that prohibits or that would say it's wrong to have more than one woman. Nothing. And I'm going to show you that in just a moment, the prohibition type texts. This is a list of qualifications, right? This is a list of qualifications for being an overseer. He's talking explicitly about making appointments of older men, and then he talks about someone being free from accusation. Now, as I talked about in part 1, it was against Roman law to have more than one wife. Paul does not explicitly state a husband of one wife is because of that. That's true. He doesn't say anything, right? He doesn't explain it or say that it's because of this, prohibition or anything. He just says, you make appointments of older men, and they have to be free from accusation. I believe that an accusation likely to be made against a Christian overseer at this time is that it's against the law to have more than one wife under Roman law, Roman occupation. So they're trying to be free from accusation under an occupying power that says it's illegal to have more than one wife. Their law and their scriptures show this, that it's not a problem, but they're under Roman law and rule, and now Christian in the sense that they are not under the law. They don't have to follow it, like I said earlier, and disobey. Like, for example, if the surviving brother were to marry his dead brother's wife and already have a wife, right, that would put him in conflict with Roman law. But here, it wouldn't, because in a Christian sense, that's not a requirement. We're not under the law in that sense, and so we are able to fulfill what laws might say, limit how many women we can have. So the whole context is very clearly specific men being appointed to a position of overseer during a time when the Romans had a law against having more than one wife. It's specifically speaking about being free from accusation. There is no accusation that could be made based on their accepted biblical laws at this time. The only accusation I can think of would be what I just said. So I have provided an answer, an example of why this would be said. And it's contextual, it's historical, it's not anachronistic. I'm not reading back. That's what the situation was. I have not heard anyone who disagrees with me on that provide another reason why. What other kind of accusation could he be talking about? Not in the Bible, and there is one based on the existing powers laws. I think that's what he's talking about. That's why it's limited to these people, right? You don't want the people you're going around appointing as like the leader, the not leader, but representative of that area, and this new kind of religion that's already dealing with persecutions. And you've got the person who's representing your religion there in open violation of an existing Roman law. I think that would be highly problematic and create more problems. He does not in any way attach this to anyone but an overseer. That's who's under discussion. The whole process of appointing older men is what's under discussion. Now, it goes on to talk about having believing children that are not under a charge of debauchery nor unruly, right? Not everybody has that. Not everybody has children who are believing. Does that mean you're not a Christian? You've got children, but they just didn't take to the message, and they don't believe. Of course not, right? You do your best, you try, but Paul is saying, look, you're still a Christian, yeah, but because of how it looks, because we want the people who we're appointing as overseers to look and represent what is free from accusation, so no one can say, hey, look, this guy, you're telling us to come and listen to this person speak to us about these texts and all this stuff that happened, and he can't even keep his own children together. Is that not what Paul's saying? He's not saying a person with unbelieving children who act unruly are not Christians. He's saying if you've got kids who don't listen and who are unruly, and you can't be appointed. No, you can't be appointed because you got to be free from accusation. That's like, he says it twice in two texts. And so then he goes on, he must be free from it. He says it again, right? Not self-willed, prone to wrath. These are a little bit more, obviously, things you wouldn't want to have in someone. Not a smiter, greedy person, hospitable, right? But he really kind of presents two things. Don't be free from accusation. Husband, one wife, having believing children. Okay, we don't want them to be able to point to things like you're in open violation of existing Roman laws and you have kids that don't even listen to you, so why would we listen to you? Neither one of those make you a non-Christian. Nothing in the Bible says if you have unbelieving children and you have more than one woman, someone who's, you're right, again, we're talking about a biblical model. We're not talking about this later hedonism and insanity, right? We're talking about an actual family with a man as its head and more than one woman who submit to that man and work together as a loving family to praise God and live as long and as best you can. There's no abuse, and if there is, you're doing something wrong. It's simple as that. That's how we were made. That's how we get along best. That's real love. All this other stuff is abuse. It doesn't work. Okay, so there's nothing in the Bible that says if you're a man like that, with women like that, and you're living like that, just like in the Old Testament, there's nothing in the New Testament that says you're not a Christian or you will not inherit God's kingdom. Just like the associated description of having believing children not under charge of debauchery and unruly. That doesn't make you a Christian if you have children like that. I'm sure we can all agree, right? Or is someone going to tell me that if you have children that don't believe, you're not a Christian, but you believe? I don't think so. Okay. So the one text, the single text that says husband of one, right, uses the actual word one. Let's go to the Bible Hub real quick. Titus 1:6. Got the little, we'll leave you guys right there. That way I can see you too. We got the chat right there. Very nice. Oh, by the way, good to see you, Everett. Bring that up there. Good to see you, Everett, Betsy, BJ, and Sonia Carbajal. Very nice. Thank you all for joining me a second day. Glad to be here. I wanted to do this. I had a little time. I got my sound working, so I'm kind of pumped up there. And I really did want to address a couple things, right? Because like the text we just read, we'll go to it right now, right, Titus? I've had some people suggest, I'm doing this for my own, as a justification for wanting to have more than one woman, right? And again, these same people somehow are not able to provide anything that specifically says that's not acceptable and not consistent with the biblical text. But there's some things they bring up we're going to get to, right? Each having his own wife or own husband. We're going to get to it. I talked about it a little bit before already, but we'll go back to it. I'm talking about what the Bible explicitly teaches. Do we have a basis for saying you can't be a Christian, right? Fornication is not having more than one woman in the way that we're talking about as a actual family arrangement with one husband as the head. I'm going to do a separate show on fornication, the meanings of those words, Hebrew and Greek. I've talked about it a little bit already in other shows, but I'm going to get to a specific show just about those words in the next couple of weeks. I was going to combine it with this, but it's just too much material. So you can either trust me or wait for the show or look up on your own and see. Fornication, the word for fornication, porneia, does not mean having more than one woman in the sense in which it's described in the Bible for people like I mentioned earlier. So that's never a meaning of fornication. Adultery, I'm just giving you quick summaries. We'll get to this in a more extended show and really look at it deeply coming up here, is when you leave your man or woman for someone else. Or if you're a woman, right, and you have relations with someone or even a man, right? If it's not someone you're a man who is bringing a woman home as a woman to be part of the family. Again, I'm using the biblical examples and what they show. If a man has a woman or even more than one woman just goes out and casually has sex with someone who he doesn't intend to keep, I don't believe that would be consistent with the way the Bible presents a man as having more than one woman in a proper way. I'm not saying it's necessarily easy or even possible today. And I'm not even saying that anything I'm presenting would provide me with a basis for having more than one woman, because I consider myself an overseer according to the text here in Titus, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. So if I did decide, for example, that I wanted to have more than one woman in a biblical sense, like the Bible presents and no different, then I would step down. I wouldn't go against the text in Titus 1 because to me, very clear. We are not to have, if we're an overseer, more than one woman. It's the one text, right? It's literally, you want a 1 Corinthians 8:6 similar thing. Well, this is it. What was that text? Let's go real quickly here. 1:6, I apologize. Looks like the Bible Hub's a little slow right there. All right, so here, New International, an elder must be blameless, faithful to his wife. And that's not a good translation. It's NIV once again collapses and misrepresents the text. A man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. No. No, that's not what it says. Let's see what else it says, though. Other English Standard, husband of one wife. The husband of one wife. King James Bible. Same as the New King James. New American Standard, husband of one wife. American Standard, husband of one wife. Where's the Net Bible? Husband of one wife. New Revised Standard says married only once. That's not what it says either. Let's just go ahead and take a look at it. I've already looked at it, though, so. Yeah, got to be so careful with NIV, huh, everybody? It's a catastrophe. It's like a Trinitarian biased Bible on steroids. And it screws up a lot of other stuff, too, but boy, is that a terrible translation. Okay, I mean, it gets some things right sometimes, but I mean, overall, it's unbelievable. Right here. Of one wife. Husband. So it doesn't say faithful to his wife. The word faithful is not used here. It's just, he has one wife. Okay, yeah, okay, you can always argue extendedly. Again, in NIV, we're not here to interpret. You're here to present the text, NIV, especially when it's pretty clear. We don't need to have it like reworded to be more clear than clear. It's clear, okay? It says, for overseers or elders, you have to be a man of one wife. And it's directly connected with having children who are obedient, neither one of which in the New Testament would disqualify you as being a Christian, or are somehow presented as this disqualifying characteristic for inheriting the kingdom. So this is what it says. This is the one text where it is explicit, everybody. An overseer is to have one woman. And I believe, I hold myself to this standard because of my having a regular gathering of people that I help maintain and that I am overseen in that sense to help make sure remain on the path to life by following the Christ, right? It's my job. It's what I'm here to do, and it's what I am doing. So I have to accept the things that I would apply to me just because of what I'm doing and what the text says these people do. So I'm not using this discussion or this question of polygamy or a man having more than one woman to in any way even it in fact keeps me from doing the very thing that people who criticize me for saying the Bible's not against having more than one woman, the very thing many of them say is my reason for doing that, my motivation, is disproven by the fact that what I'm saying prevents me from doing what they claim I'm doing. Ha ha! So, no. I'm here to make sense of the Bible. And a lot of you anti-polygamists just can't deal with the Bible. You have a hard time making sense of all these prominent men of God having more than one woman. Or Jesus' illustration of the 10 virgins. Or texts like, let's go to, I'll save that for the end. 1 Corinthians 7, where it says, husbands, you act with the ones who have wives, plural, be as though you had none. We'll get to that in a moment. It's got more material there. But there are texts in the New Testament that clearly seem consistent with what the Old Testament depicts all over the place and in the law. So, unless you're an overseer, if someone who's like me doing regular shepherding and overseeing of people in a congregation setting, if that person has more than one woman, it would be appropriate to confront that person according to Matthew 18 and say, wait a minute, You're clearly in an overseer's position, and yet you have more than one woman. Why is that? Paul says the overseer should have one. Why are you not? See, we don't want to just assume immediately it's like someone knowingly wanting to violate what Paul's saying. Maybe there is a cultural or historic, there's something in the specific setting of that person in that location on the earth that's, maybe there's no one else there, right? Maybe it's the man with his women and he's trying to develop a congregation but doesn't have anyone who can do anything like what he's doing, even though he has more than one woman. But I'm speaking hypothetically, but then this man is trying to develop a congregation and have people who could assume that position, and then he would comply, right? What if he said that? Hey, I'm just doing this temporarily. We don't have anyone here, and I'm kind of stuck in the position of trying to develop a congregation with my several wives, and yeah, I see what Paul says there, but I don't have anyone I can turn this over to right now. I don't think that would be right. Is that something you would condemn the person over, or say it seems like they're clearly trying to comply and they're just waiting for someone to take over? And yeah, I see Paul says that. One woman, overseer. So once I get an overseer, I'm going to step down, and that way I'll be in everything will be free from accusation, right? That's the point. Being free from accusation. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at what would make you subject to accusation, right? What does the New Testament actually say you should not do, or don't do this, or you're going to die, right? You're not going to inherit the kingdom. Wouldn't those texts be the most likely place where you're going to find things? Well, I mean, that's where you do find things you're not supposed to do. Excuse me. In the case of an overseer, we can see Titus 1, very clear. No problem, no conflict here. I accept that, and I would live according to it. That does not apply to anyone else, though. Just like having children who are unbelieving, there's very clearly an elevated standard here that Paul is talking about that is not one that would prevent you from being a Christian otherwise. All right, so let's take a look at some of these other texts, though. These prohibition texts. Let's do a little split screen here, and I'll put it up this way. I'll come to the chat here in a moment. We'll take a look at any questions you may have, but let's look at these texts, right? So when I am faced with the question of, okay, is this right or is this wrong? As you know, we're Christian witnesses of Jah. So we promote three things above all else. One God, the Father, Jah. Firstborn Son, the Messiah sent to the earth, Jesus. Golden rule. If there's something very clearly said you're not to do in the Bible, don't do this, or those who do this will be punished or not inherit this. Or like the apostolic decree, right? We no further burden except these things. That is very clear. And we would then, if someone did those things and tried to represent themselves as Christian, or that they were sinning openly or against us, then we would Matthew 18. We'd follow that process. We'd go to the person, confront them. Hey, you're committing you're stealing a bunch of stuff here. It says that you're not supposed to be stealing, right? We don't do these things as Christians. Oh, you got okay, you're gonna get help. Okay, well, let's get you help, right? We're gonna call the police though, so you can return the item. Or the person says, no, I don't care. I'm gonna do what I want, and then okay, we've got a problem here. You take care of the person, take the congregation. Hey, this person's a thief. We can't have him around. No, you want to hang out with him, you do that. But as a congregation, no, we're not going to recommend him. No, he's a known thief. You can't do that with a person who has more than one woman because there's nothing in the New Testament that says that. There's nothing you can use. What are you going to use? Yeah, we'll get to your each have his own wife and husband in just a minute. That does not say you cannot have more than one woman. As you're going to see, it specifically speaks to not having casual relationships, but having your actual spouse as your husband or wife with whom you live and you exist as a family. Just like when it says God the blood of his own in Acts 20:28, idios, we'll get to it. But that's having to do with an actual relationship or relative, your own son, your own wife. The Bible, even in multi-wife contexts, right? Genesis and Jesus referring to it, the two become one flesh. You can only have sex and relationships with someone one at a time. That's why Abraham and Sarah had Isaac, and Abraham and Hagar had Ishmael. The two became one flesh in each of those conditions, relationships, even though they were both his women, his wives. So when anti-polygamists say, hey, you only have your own husband, your own wife, we're going to get to it in a minute, but I'm just kind of getting to it. That's not a prohibition. I'm bringing it up now because I'm going to read you the New Testament prohibitions. Here they are. These in addition to the apostolic decree, which we'll go to as well. But look at right here. It says in Matthew 25:34, then the king will say to those on his right? So this is talking about all the people who are approved by Jesus at his coming. Not necessarily the Christians, but this is still would apply to a lot of people. What is it that Jesus is looking at here as to whether or not they are going to be approved to enter into the new earth, the kingdom, the great crowd, right? The nations. He says, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who have been blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the founding of the world. I became hungry and you gave me something to eat. I got thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you received me hospitably. Naked and you clothed me. I fell sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to me. That's what they're going to be judged over, everybody. The Son of Man is not going to be looking at whether or not they have more than one woman. He's going to be looking at, look, did you take care of my followers when they were being persecuted? My point is that it's not an issue that comes up here at all. Now, a lot of other things don't come up here either, and that's just true. This is what matters. He already knows we're sinners. You're not going to be able to stop all that stuff. You will be able to do what's right, like Joseph, when the time comes, even if you fail at other times. So always remember that. This is what he looks at, right? This is the type of stuff that is going to really matter to the Son of Man. Okay, but other stuff does matter too, especially for his bride, right? And to those of us who are, committed to him. There's a little bit higher standard there. That's true. All right, so he says here in Matthew 15, starting verse 17, are you not aware that everything, make this a little bit easier to see, everything entering into the mouth passes along into the intestines and is discharged into the sewer. However, the things proceeding out of the mouth come out of the heart, and those things defile a man. What are those things? For example, out of the heart come wicked reasonings, murders, adulteries, fornications, thieveries, false testimonies, blasphemies. Excuse me. These are the things that defile a man. But to take a meal with unwashed hands, that does not defile a man. These things right here, murders, wicked reasonings, adulteries, leaving your wife or husband, fornications, porneia, abusive sexual practices. And there's a little bit more to it, but we'll get to those separately. But neither of those involving having more than one woman in a biblical sense without leaving those women. It's all over the place, exemplified by men of God and even brought about by God. So none of these involve having more than one woman. Luke 18:18, a certain ruler questioned him, saying, good teacher, by doing what shall I inherit everlasting life? Jesus said to him, why do you call me good? Nobody is good except one, God. which proves right here he's not a God-man, he's not equal to God, and he doesn't share God's nature, Trinitarians. He right here makes a attribute difference and distinction between him and God. Something that God has as an attribute of goodness inherent to his nature, he doesn't have. He says right here, Trinitarians, you just lie and say, no, he doesn't really mean that. He just means, oh, you got to really realize I'm God if you say that. No, he doesn't say that at all, does he, Trinitarians? He denies an essential attribute difference with the Father, or he accepts that difference, but he denies he has the attribute shared with the Father on the same level. That's a difference in nature. I'm going to do a whole show about these texts that clearly show the Son does not have the same nature as the Father, sharing it, right? They're both spirits. Or when he's on earth, of course, he's a man, right? Last Adam. Trinitarians think he's a God-man here. So he'd have to be good in the same way that God is good and wouldn't be able to say this because you can't distinguish in the natures and the characteristic differences. And he's making a reference to God. So if he felt he was God in that same essential way, Trinitarians, he wouldn't be saying this. No. But we'll move on because I'm going to do a whole show about it. You know the commandments. Do not commit adultery. Do not murder. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Honor your father and your mother. And then the man said, all these I've kept from my youth on. After hearing that, Jesus said, there's one thing lacking about you. Sell the things you have and distribute to poor people, and you'll have treasure in the heavens, and come be my follower. And it's basically the same account we have in Mark 18. Right? So right here, Jesus refers to the law. The same law that talks about how you can have more than one woman. And he's not in any way associating adultery with having more than one woman, unless, as we've discussed in part 1, you leave that woman or man. But right here, though, he's clearly referring back to the law and using it as a basis for things you shouldn't do in terms of what is good, right? So why would he do that if the law had in it things that were bad at this time in his mind? He wouldn't. And so clearly Jesus was not against polygamy. And he even considered it as something that would be appropriate, certainly as he's fulfilling the law. All right, 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10. What? Do you not know that unrighteous persons will not inherit God's kingdom? Okay, what's an unrighteous person? Is a person with more than one woman who's acting as an actual wife according to the Bible, and you as an actual husband, and not abusive? Is that unrighteous? It's since New Testament times, right? We already know about overseers. That's very clear, very specific. But it's not everybody. Just like not everybody has believing children. Do not be misled. Neither fornicators, porneia, abusive sexual perverts, as we will discuss further in another show, but you can look it up on your own and see very clearly. That's not talking, porneia is not having more than one woman in a wife-like sense according to the Bible. Nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men kept for unnatural purposes, right? Homos, or men who lie with men. This is very explicit, homos. No sodomy. You're not supposed to do that. If you want to, hey, go ahead. Knock yourselves out, homos. Go ahead and pleasure yourselves at each other's expense all you want. Or you abusive heteros, you porneia fornicators who want to sodomize your women. Hey, you're not helping that woman, and you're not helping yourself. So you might want to rethink that, because that is actually fornication. That is abusive sexual practices, and that's not how you're supposed to treat your woman or women. Nor thieves, nor greedy persons, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners. There is nothing here about having more than one woman in the sense in which the Bible describes men of God having more than one woman, and women of God having one husband whom they assist and support as we all work together to praise God the Father, right? I mean, it's about what you're doing. Now, how are you doing this? What do you mean by this stuff? I'm talking about the Bible, everyone. I'm trying to follow the Bible and maintain the consistency that I see so that we not only can do what is correct ourselves, but teach others, and show, hey, this is not a contradiction. This having more than one woman in the Old Testament is not a contradiction with the New Testament. There's reasons for some of these limitations or prohibition in the sense of an overseer. There's certain things that were happening here and that aren't happening here, but that doesn't mean that we can't do what was done all over the place back there, as long as we're compliant with the laws of the land and not leaving our women, not abusing them sexually or otherwise. I don't see that anything like that is prohibited in the New Testament unless you're an overseer. And none of these prohibitions talk about it at all. They get very descriptive, like Paul, right? Lying with men, men with men, fornicators, unnatural purposes. What's natural? Well, it's natural for a man to be with a woman. And a man can only have relations with one woman at one time. And in the Bible, two becoming flesh, like God intended, is applied to relationships where men have more than one woman, but become one with each woman at a time. So none of that in any way explicitly prohibits non-overseers, Christian overseers, from having more than one woman in a biblical sense, where you have a family together living as a biblical model of how a husband takes care of his women without violating the laws of the land, right? We can't do that as Christians. Galatians 5, for the flesh is against the spirit in its desire, and the spirit against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other, so that the very things that you would like to do, you do not do. Furthermore, if you are being led by the Spirit, you're not under law. Now the works of the flesh are manifest. They're fornication, uncleanness, loose conduct. We're going to talk about all these words in a whole separate show coming up soon. But none of these involve having more than one wife. If any of you think you can show me that fornication, uncleanness, or loose conduct in any way involve a man having more than one wife in a biblical sense, I'd like to see it, because I don't think you can do it, because those words don't mean that. Idolatry, practice of spiritism, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, contentions, divisions, sex, envies, sex, S-E-C-T-S, drunken bouts, revelries, and things like these. As to these things, I'm forewarning you, the same as I did forewarn you, that those who practice such things will not inherit God's kingdom. Right? So there's nothing here about having more than one woman. Right? This is the same Paul that explicitly limited overseers to one woman. Right? I think if he really thought that it was bad, right? Like, you're not supposed to, as a Christian man, have more than one woman in a biblical sense in which you don't leave them, in which you are a loving head of a household and not an overseer. I think if it was something like that, where you can't do it at all, it would be listed in one of these texts, right? It's not. Nowhere. Ephesians 5. For you know this, recognizing it for yourselves, that no fornicator or unclean person or greedy person, which means being an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Right? There's no fornicator, no man with more than one woman, nothing like that, not anywhere at all. Revelation 22:15. I made a little note for myself right there. Outside are the dogs and those who practice spiritism and the fornicators and the murderers and the idolaters and everyone liking and carrying on a lie. Nothing, everybody. Nothing about this. Fornicators, again, porneia, the sexually abusive perverts. In the adultery, of course, leaving your woman. We're not talking about that. That's not what the Bible teaches, nor what we advocate. we're just trying to do the best we can, everybody, to please God the Father, follow the Son, and remain consistent with the New Testament. And what I'm presenting is just what the Bible teaches as I understand it. I believe it subjects me to only having one woman as an overseer. But if I had a Christian man I met in a land or in a way where he has more than one woman who's actually his, not someone who will leave him and he's not leaving them or her, and they're living according to how the Bible presents that for non-overseers, I'm not going to judge that person. They can't be an overseer. That's clear. But there's no basis for me to judge them and say they're not a Christian. Right? That would be like me saying a Christian man who has one woman, but who has unbelieving children who are unruly, not a Christian, right? Because Paul says overseers can't have that. That doesn't make any sense, does it? So I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to judge. The likelihood this is going to be a big issue is very low. Although, who knows, right? I mean, it's not about the likelihood. But again, I don't believe this is something that's going to come up frequently for most people. But it does come up. It is an issue. The Bible does teach having more than one woman all throughout the Old Testament. And it only limits it in a specific case of an overseer in the New Testament. Now, there are some texts that it may seem like it's limiting it to one for non-overseers. Let's go to one of those texts, right? 1 Corinthians 7. Let's take a look at it in the NWT first. 1 Corinthians 7. First Corinthians 7. And we'll read 1 through 15. Just so we get a good sense of what's going on here, right? And this is brought up a lot by anti-polygamists as saying, hey, they think this kind of proves you can only have one woman even if you're not an overseer. I don't think so. So let's take a look at it. Oh, Everett, thank you for the super chat. I didn't see it until just now. So once again, I appreciate it. You don't need to, but you're very... anyone who wants to show support and love like that, of course, we will always accept. But you're very very good in that way. So I want to make it clear, though, that you're a great contributor, a long-standing Christian brother. So I appreciate you outside of any of that. But the fact that you do make those contributions is also appreciated. So thank you, Tetragrammaton. He says, Greg, what if someone says women can have more than one husband? Would that be a sin, sin if the woman registers marriages with all husbands? Yes, it is a sin. Nothing in the Bible supports a woman having more than one husband. That's not how God made us. A man having more than one woman has children by those women, but he knows they're all his children. If a woman has multiple husbands, you wouldn't know whose child it is. Now, today you could find out, of course, and that's not how the Bible presents the way we were made. If the Bible presented it that way and said, here gave us all these examples of women having multiple husbands and that being okay, God being okay with that, well, then yeah, but it doesn't. So we don't have any basis for doing so, and the Bible repeatedly shows us that's not how we were made, and biology agrees with that. The effects of women with multiple partners are pretty dramatic, physiologically and emotionally. They're very damaging to the woman. But for a man to have more than one woman, that does not damage the man. And women seem to be able to manage that when they understand it's not against the Bible or against the law, right? When they don't think it's a problem. Much easier to fall into that role historically that I can see. So that's how I would answer it. Let's get to the text now in 1 Corinthians. Good question, though, Tetragrammaton. That's something, obviously, women today and the feminists, they hate to hear that because they think they're the same as men, but they're not. That doesn't mean they're less in some way. They're different. Women and men are different. And if feminists and non-Christian women want to think that they can have more than one man and be okay, go for it. Go pump yourselves into oblivion. Go enjoy life and have as many men, and let's see how that works out for you. I don't see that that's going to be beneficial to a woman. It seems like it wrecks them. Whether or not it can work for a man would depend on whether or not he has the women who are going to function together effectively to do what the Bible shows us, right? It's pretty much that simple to me, at least in terms of what I can see. Well, let's look at this text here in 1 Corinthians, right? This is what the anti-polygamists in the New Testament really, this is what they love to go to outside of Titus, because they know Titus is contextually limited and doesn't make sense for non-overseers because of the children part, right? Very obvious that there are Christians who have unbelieving children who are unruly. So they can't really deal with the Titus limitation. So they come over here. Yeah, well, we can't help the feminists, right? They're gone. The feminists are not helping women or themselves. If they were, does it look like they're happy? I don't think so. It doesn't look like they're doing anything of extended benefit to themselves, and it looks like they're ruining themselves in society for the most part. Certainly becoming more permissive to things like homo and other immoral things that are essentially phasing out the women. Look what's happening, women. The men are becoming women and then winning at your sports and things. So your permissiveness, a lot of you feminists, not you Christian women, I know. These feminists, though, they're destroying themselves. You got a Supreme Court justice who doesn't even know what a woman is. All right, it's now an actual issue because they're so confused and screwed up. So nothing they're doing, none of this is working, right? It's not producing anything better, I'll tell you that. 1 Corinthians 7. Now concerning the things about which you wrote, it's well for a man not to touch a woman. Right? See, women, what you should understand, if you don't already, is men and women are made for each other, and men are very attracted to you. Especially if you're a Christian woman, and I don't want to get into examples. I have met some so-called Christian women, and the extent to which they go to change their appearance to become more attractive is unbelievable. Okay, I know it, that some people say, and they don't mean they claim to be devoted to God and they prove false. I'm just saying, think about this, you Christian women. You know, the thing is, men will think you're attractive either way. You really don't need to add much of anything. But you guys have reached a point now where you're doing the surgeries and the makeup is just so, you guys put the Egyptians to shame with your makeup. Is that really what we need? Is that really going to make you humble enough to help a man the way you're supposed to? It seems like it's making you all more arrogant. And the attention you're getting disconnects you from your actual function in this world, which is find a man that you can work with and help and raise a family, or be on your own and follow the Christ, right? You don't have to get married. But if you are going to find a man, then why make it more difficult on him or other men by changing your appearance so dramatically? Hey, if you want to, if that's how you want to be, go for it. It seems like you're going to spend a lot of money and time doing something that isn't really going to benefit you in the right ways. You're just artificially creating a tension that makes it harder on us, more difficult for us. And you're supposed to be helping us. So instead of helping us, it's like you guys are like the opposite of help. You're like herders now. A lot of you women are out there just making yourself so desirable, and you're driving Sam crazy, right? He's burning up with lust all the time. That's his problem, though. But most people, right, you don't try to make it a little easier for us, right? Might make it more easy on yourself, right? Are you sure that much attention is necessary? Oh, no, right? Isn't it supposed to be going to God and the Christ? Seems like it. 1 Corinthians 11:3, but we're here. 1 Corinthians 7:1. Okay, concerning things I wrote, it's well for a man not to touch a woman, yet because of the prevalence of fornication, let each man have his own wife, and each woman have her own husband. So this prevalence of fornication, right? Paul talks about this a lot. And he explicitly says that the Corinthians are doing things in ways that even the nations don't do, right? In fact, let's see if we can find that. Let's see here. It just kind of came to me. Right here, 1 Corinthians. I knew it was in the close context, so I wanted to just go to it. Right here, look. Right before he gets to our subject text, 1 Corinthians 7, in 1 Corinthians 5:1, he says, actually, fornication is reported among you. And so, we'll talk more about this in our specific video about this, but look at this. Such fornication as is not even among the nations, that a wife of a certain man has of his father. So you have perverse sexual practices going on here, right? You've got children going after their parents' wives. It seems, in any case, according to the translation of NWT, but certainly fornication that's beyond even the nations. Okay? So what were the nations doing? What was fornication? What's he talking about? He's very clearly talking about perverted sexual practices. He explicitly states it right here, such as not even beyond the nations, and a level of incest that is completely inappropriate, right? Not according to the law. So that's what he's talking about. He's not talking about having more than one wife in a biblical sense. He's talking about porneia in a non-biblical sense. So when we get to it again, as he's talking about it with respect to marriage, he says it's best if you don't touch a woman, but because of this fornication, because of all this crazy stuff you guys are doing beyond even the nations, have your own wife and your woman have your own husband. Now, anti-polygamists say this means you're only supposed to have one. But that's not what it says. It doesn't use the word for one. We're going to get to it, and we'll go to the Bible Hub in just a second. Let's read the rest of the account. Let the husband render to his wife her due, and the wife also likewise to her husband. The wife does not exercise authority over her own body, but her husband does. Likewise also the husband does not exercise authority over his body, but his wife does. See, so right there, women, there's not this unequal ownership or use of each of our bodies. When we take a person home as our wife and we have relations, we become one with that person. And that person then has authority over us because we're one. We're not two, we're one. So it's just as much hers as it is his. That's true in every single biblical polygamous sense that is discussed. Like I mentioned with Sarah and Abraham and Sarah and Hagar earlier. So while it may seem like the way he talks is very much like that, the two becoming one, and so it sort of seems like it's limiting it to one. Even if we granted that's possible, okay, maybe that's possible, it's still applied by Jesus to what is true of people with more than one woman in the Old Testament. So it does not explicitly prohibit a man from having more than one woman in a biblical sense, by having his own woman or husband, or woman her own husband, the way Paul's talking about. It's entirely consistent with the two becoming one flesh. We'll get to this whole own thing in a moment as well. Do not be depriving each other except by mutual consent for an appointed time, right? So there has to be agreement. Let's say man has a woman, and she's on her menstrual cycle, and the man wants to have sex anyway, and the woman says no. Even though the man's the head of the woman, the man cannot force her to do that. Christian women, having men as your head does not mean you have to accept abuse or things that are clearly against the Bible. No. In fact, that would be porneia, right? If your husband forced you to have sex, we'll talk about more when we talk about fornication, while you're having a menstrual cycle and you don't agree, it says right here you have to have mutual consent. And you're not supposed to be depriving each other, but there are times when you can't do it, or you don't want to do it. You can't do that. You can't just play games, right? But if your body isn't ready for sexual relations and you're not agreeable, then the man can't force himself on you. That would be porneia. You would have grounds to divorce the person. You're not giving your consent. That's what porneia is. It can be sodomy, it can be pedo, it can be a son going after his father's woman. It can be a man forcing a woman to have relations, or maybe the woman she's just got to have it, right? And she's on her menstrual cycle, and she says, you got to wake up. The man's like, no, you're menstruating. I don't consent. And the woman forces herself on the man. Says, no, you're going to, not as likely, but hey, that's porneia. Then you're giving the man license to leave you there. You're literally going against this text that says you have to have mutual consent. Menstruating woman. All right, so hopefully it's becoming a little more clear, and we'll get to it in a deeper show soon. Very important to understand that, though. However, I say this by way of concession, not in the way of command. Right, so he's talking about none of this is really being given as a command. He's basically saying it's a good idea not to touch a woman, but we got this problem with this fornication. Right, we got people who are not mutually consenting. We got people going after parents, women. Right, we've got things beyond even what the nations are doing happening with you people. We got a real problem here. So, you should have your own woman, your own husband. It doesn't say one, it says your own. And we'll get to that in a second, show what it means more. But he's clearly not giving commands here. We're not talking about overseers, so this is generally applicable, right? But I wish all men were as myself, right? He wants that, but he's not saying it has to be. A lot of people read Paul in this way, and they don't understand what he's saying. Nevertheless, each one has his own gift from God, one in this way, another in that way. I say to the unmarried persons and the widows, it's well for them to remain as I am. But if they don't have self-control, let them marry. It's better to marry than to be inflamed with passion. So while Sam, you might be better off married because of your uncontrollable burning lust you can't help but frequently mention, you Catholic women, you might want to run from Sam, okay? He's out of control, and you don't want to have to fall into this category right here with Sam. Right? He's in his condition, right? He's got various problems, so just be prepared, women, right? Find men who are actually capable of managing themselves. No one's perfect, but if you can't control yourself and you have burning lust, then another Catholic woman out there, you're out of control. Just find Sam. You guys can work on each other, and hopefully you can calm him down, okay? To the married people, I give instructions, yes, not I, but the Lord, that a wife should not depart from her husband, right? So here now he's entering into command area, right? He just said he wasn't giving commands really up here. And now he says, okay, to you married people, you have a wife, you have a husband. A wife should not leave her husband, which is exactly what Jesus says about people committing adultery, right? You leave your wife, you leave your husband for someone else. That's what Jesus says is adultery. Paul right here starts going into the Lord command position and says the same thing. Don't leave. You can't do that. That's not how this works. You want to start having more than one woman, Christian man? You cannot leave them. If they leave you, that's different, as Paul's going to say here in a moment. And just in general, right? If someone chooses to leave you, well, that's what Jesus is saying is adultery. The woman's leaving you, and she's your woman, or you're her husband, and you leave her, that's adultery. That's what Paul is. He's saying, don't leave right here. If she should actually depart, let her remain unmarried or else make up again with her husband. Because if she doesn't, right, she's committing adultery. If you leave who you're with for someone else, that's adultery. If you don't leave the person you're with and you bring another woman, if you're a man in a biblical sense, that's not adultery. Otherwise, almost every man in the Old Testament committed adultery. So you see the consistency that I'm trying to establish here? And I'm not trying to establish a way for me to have more than one woman, that's for sure, because I'm actually doing the very opposite, right? I can't. But I'm going to listen to what the Bible says. It's that simple. And a husband should not leave his wife. But to the others I say, yes, not I, but not, yes, I, not the Lord. Okay, he's back to himself now. If any brother has an unbelieving wife, and yet she's agreeable to dwelling with him, let him not leave her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and yet he's agreeable to dwelling with her, let her not leave her husband, right? So we're not supposed to leave anybody. Once you take them home, or you go to the man's home, and you have relations, that's it. You can't leave. You can, but then you're committing adultery. And let's see, whereas he gets into, where does he say? Oh, yeah. Okay, now, and then he goes on in the latter part of 1 Corinthians 7, before we go back to the early part of 1 Corinthians 7 and at the Bible Hub on the whole, his own wife, his own husband part. Look at verse 24. In whatever condition each one was called, brothers, let him remain in it associated with God. Right before that, you were bought with a price. Stop becoming slaves of men. In whatever condition you were called, brothers. So if someone who was called that had more than one woman, like a Jewish man living according to the law, and he's called to follow the Christ, he says, let him remain. Whatever condition you were called, let him remain and associated with God. Associated with God. You mean to tell me that Paul doesn't mean to include Jewish people who are called, who had more than one wife according to the law? I doubt that. And then it says in verse 27, are you bound to a wife? Stop seeking a release. He doesn't say you can't have another woman. He says you can't leave the woman you're with. Are you with a wife? Can't leave her. All consistent with everything we've been talking about in this video and in the first one, from the text that involved Jesus to Paul. It's consistent, is it not? You can't leave the person. If you leave, you're done. You can go back. You can go back to the man you left that you shouldn't have left because now you're committing adultery. But if you have a man and you're a Christian woman, you should be satisfied and you should work together. And if you don't want the man to have another woman, then you should tell him that and make it clear and work together. Verse 28, but even if you did marry, you would commit no sin. And if a virgin married, such one would commit no sin. However, those who do will have tribulation in the flesh, but I'm sparing you. Now listen to this. Moreover, this I say, brothers, the time left is reduced. Henceforth, let those who have wives be as though they had none. Why wouldn't it say those who have a wife if it only meant one? So I no more believe that up here when it says each have his own wife and his own husband, consistent with the two becoming one flesh, whether that's Abraham and Sarah or Abraham and Hagar, no more believe that means you have to have one. Then this means you have to have more than one. But this certainly seems consistent with people existing at that time who were not overseers, who may have even been called, according to verse 24, while having more than one woman and remaining in that condition, according to verse 24. It specifically says in verse 29, those who have wives or women. It's the plural in Greek. I looked it up before the show. Let's go ahead and wrap this up by taking a look at the Bible Hub in 1 Corinthians 7. Let's take a look first at verse. We'll end it right after our view of these two texts. Verse 2. 1 Corinthians 7, 2. First Corinthians 7, 2. Thank you all for joining me this evening. Looks like Bible Hub's a little bit slow in loading right there. And we're going to wrap it up after we take a look at a couple texts in 1 Corinthians 7. Thank you for joining me. I hope this has been a good show. I'll take a quick look at the chat before I conclude it, in case there was a significant question. But I wanted to have this follow-up to make it clear what my position is on polygamy in the Bible. I follow the Bible. I follow the New Testament. I consider myself an overseer, and as long as I do, I would not be able to have more than one woman. And if I ever decide to have more than one woman in a biblical sense, I would not be an overseer. I follow the Bible, where it explicitly teaches things that I should be judged over. Where it does not, where there's no prohibition anywhere against having more than one woman in the New Testament, I'm not going to judge people. If they're not an overseer and they have more than one woman and they're living according to what the Bible says, not leaving who they're with, I don't have a basis for judging people. Sorry, they're not my slave. Only if they try to do things that clearly violate what the text explicitly teaches. 1 Corinthians 7, 2, the part where each having his own wife and own husband. Here's what it says. We read it in the NWT, right? It says, because of sexual immorality, porneos, we'll talk about that word in a future show in more detail, each one, the own, or the of him, wife, let have. And each woman, the own, husband, let have. Now you'll notice here there's actually a difference between what it says of the man and what it says of the woman. With regard to the man, it says, each man, heskatos, the own of him wife let have, tain heao tu, gunaika eketo. So it says, the of him, the of his own. It doesn't use the word idios here, an adjective. It uses a personal pronoun, of him, of himself. Let each man have the wife of himself, of his own wife. And in regards to the woman, it says, heskate ton idion, andra eketo. Ton idion is an adjective. It's not a personal pronoun. And it refers to what is part of her own family. Like I said with Acts 20:28, right? So you can see clearly, can you not? Here it says of the man, each man his own wife. using a personal pronoun. And with the woman, it says, let each woman the own husband have, using the adjective idios. Now, if we go to Acts 2:28, you'll see how this term is used. Comes up a lot in our Trinity discussions, right? Because Acts 20:28 sometimes is translated the blood of his own son, but son is not used. It's just the word, the adjective idios, like in 1 Corinthians 7:2. And here you can see the church of God, which he purchased with tu haimatos tu idiou, the blood of his own. And some Trinitarians say this means his own blood, but that's not what it means, right? Like we just saw with 1 Corinthians 7:2, idios as an adjective can refer to what is the direct relationship of the person. So in the case of 1 Corinthians 7:2, the woman's own husband, related to her by being his wife, right? In other words, the one you live with, the one you're having relationship with, and kids, the one you're one with, your own husband. And so it shows this direct association, this familial connection between the woman and the man in 1 Corinthians 7:2. But in 1 Corinthians 7:2, it didn't use idios for the man in relation to the woman. It used the personal pronoun. Why is that significant? I believe it's significant because it parallels, if we go to 1 Kings 11:19, here's what it says in the NWT. Right here, where I wrote conclude 1 Corinthians 7:1-15. Look what it says below that. Compare 1 Kings 11:19. And Hadad continued to find favor in the eyes of Pharaoh, so much that he gave him a wife, the sister of his own wife, the sister of the lady. Sorry, I have a little question mark there distorting the term because of the transliteration limitation of my NWT version. Either way, let's go to 1 Kings 11:19 in the Bible Hub. So we can see that Acts 20:28 parallels 1 Corinthians 7:2 in the use of idios for the woman, showing the clear familial connection she must have with the man to be what Paul's talking about. It doesn't in any way say that there can't be another woman there, like with Sarah and Hagar. It just speaks of the woman having her own familial husband, not just out there having sex with different men that aren't your familial husband. And then with regard to the man, it used the personal pronoun heautou or heautos. Let's see if we can go to that. 1 Kings 11:19. Let's see if it would take us back to 1 Corinthians 7, though. Yeah, here it goes, right here. Here's the personal pronoun for the man and the woman. Heautou, of him. So if we go to 1 Kings 11:19, look at what it says. This is the only text I could find that was pretty parallel with 1 Corinthians 7 in regards to the man's relationship to the woman that Paul's talking about. All right, so if it's talking about a man having only one woman in 1 Corinthians 7, and that's all you can have, even though that's not what it says. It doesn't even use the wording of Titus 1:6. It uses the personal pronoun. Let each man have a wife of him, his wife. In other words, not just a prostitute or someone out there who isn't part of your family at home. Random sex with these people. Or people that you're not with, right? That you've left or that you're just having occasional encounters with. In 1 Kings 11:19, look what it says. And then we'll conclude with this, everybody. Thank you for joining me. Bible Hub's a little slow tonight. So it says right here, the part we read from NWT. So he gave him as wife the sister of his own wife. That is the sister of Taphanes, queen. Now, if we look at the Greek, right, to parallel 1 Corinthians 7:2, look at what 1 Kings 11:19 says. And he gave to him a woman, brother of the woman, sister of the woman of him. We'll compare that with NWT, right? 1 Kings 11:19. Second Kings. First Kings 11:19, the New World Translation, it says, so he gave him a wife, the sister of his own wife. The sister of the wife of him. There you see, similar to 1 Corinthians 7:2 with the man and it's really his relationship with the woman, the personal pronoun. It doesn't use idios. Like 1 Corinthians 7:2 with regard to the man, it uses the personal pronoun. And so here you have a parallel with 1 Corinthians 7:2 and what it says about a man having his own wife. In the Old Testament, where men could have more than one woman. So there's no way that the reference in 1 Corinthians 7:2 with regard to man and woman and the use of the personal pronoun in the first instance can mean only one. It's literally practically the same description in the Old Testament where that was quite permissible and based on the law. And in the second part of 1 Corinthians 7:2, where it uses the adjective idios, not the personal pronoun, that is consistent with texts like Acts 20:28 to show the familial relationship between the woman and the man, because the two have become one flesh, just as was true in the Hebrew scriptures with men like Abraham who had more than one woman and became one flesh with each of them according to God's will. If you, as a Christian man who's not an overseer, want to have more than one woman who's willing to live with you and you not leave them and you all work together according to the biblical model and examples and texts and support the growth of the Christian congregation without violating the laws of the land, I'm not here to judge you. I don't have a basis for judging you. There's nothing in the Bible, in the New Testament specifically, that allows me to do so. None of the prohibitions, not even in the accounts in the book of Acts, right? Like we've read before. Let's just take a quick look at it, everybody, because I did mention that in Acts, right? We read all those prohibition texts in the New Testament, and none of them in any way had anything to do with a man having more than one woman in a biblical context. And the same is true where it concerns the decrees in the book of Acts, where twice the apostles, the older men, and the Holy Spirit favor adding no further burden. Unless you're an overseer, right? Paul makes that qualification clear. Otherwise, there's no further burden except abstain from things sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from things strangled, and from fornication, which is not having more than one woman in a biblical sense. And it repeats it as well. In Acts 21:25, We have sent out, rendering our decision that they should keep themselves from what is sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from fornication. Right? And fornication, as we saw in Paul in 1 Corinthians 5, there were problems with fornication in ways that were beyond even the nations. It was a big problem. This abusive sexual practice and perversion, whether it was sodomy, pedo, children taking their parents' wives, or not having mutual consent for an agreed upon time, all of that is porneia, abusive sexual practices, and forbidden in the New Testament explicitly, repeatedly. But that's not having more than one woman in a biblical sense. People are just lying about it. They don't even know what fornication and adultery is, it seems to me, if you actually use the Bible and not this later understanding that's based on all this heretical Christianity that really glorifies not just Mary, but the woman beyond what the Bible says. You're not supposed to be putting yourself in this kind of position, women. You're not supposed to be enhancing yourself to such an extent that you can't even help us anymore. You want us to help you. Well, we'll do that. Well, what about us? You were literally created to be our assistant and to glorify God as one with us. Regardless of whether or not your man has more than one woman agreeable to you or not, are you able to fulfill the role that God gave you according to how you're made? Because if you're not, why are you expecting us to do that? We should still do it, but it'd be a lot easier if we worked together. We didn't judge each other without having explicit biblical text to do so, and try to overlook anything we don't agree with. If we don't have something that very clearly provides a basis for us to hold someone accountable, we might have to bite our tongue a little bit. We might have to just accept that some people live differently from us. Are they violating the explicit teaching of the text or not? If not, I highly recommend you stop judging slaves of the master. Do your very best to comply with the Bible and do what it says. Work with men and women who are trying to praise God and follow the Christ. Try not to make it so distracting for men, if you're a woman, that we can barely keep our eyes off you. Just be satisfied with who you are and how God made you. And if you have to do a little bit here and there to fit in with society, no problem. But try to draw a line somewhere so that you can actually do the things that are more important versus get all this attention for no other reason than to make life harder or more difficult on yourself and us, and spend a lot more money and time doing so than you probably need to. We'll try to do the same, be loving and kind, and stay to what the Bible says, whether you're an overseer or not, men. It's time to align ourselves with the Bible. It's time to stop judging people unnecessarily. And when it comes to this question of whether the New Testament prohibits polygamy, as far as I can tell, and what is explicitly taught to us, only if you're an overseer. So with that in mind, I'd like to bid you all good night. Of course, as Christians, we uphold the laws of the land, so we wouldn't be for violating any explicit command of the law of the land unless it directly contradicts a command given to us in the Bible, in which case we would follow the commands of God and the Christ above all. Otherwise, we should try to work with whatever nation and government and people we are most near and associated with, do the best we can not to receive any accusations of doing anything otherwise, trying to be loving and kind to everybody. And again, I want to emphasize this judgment, right? This, if you don't have an understanding of what the Bible accepts and doesn't accept, it's time to stop telling other people what they're doing or not doing wrong. And focus on yourself. Focus on making the world a better place by making yourself a better person and giving God and the Christ praise while you do so. If you do that, I think you'll probably be pretty happy. And if you don't judge people according to what you don't have a basis for judging them over, I can guarantee you we'll all be more happy. To that end, thank you for joining me, and may God bless you. In Jesus' name.